All right, good afternoon, everybody. So the talk here is the calls coming from inside the house, authentication proxy attacks. My name is Chris Merkel. I'm the Senior Director of Cyber Defense at Northwestern Mutual here in Milwaukee. And in today's talk, we're going to be discussing a type of attack that we've been tracking now for just over 6 months. And the content that we'll be covering in this presentation isn't just my original research. We've got a team of absolutely brilliant folks working in detection, response, and intelligence who are responsible for a lot of the content that you see here. So I wouldn't be able to be up here talking about this if it weren't for the fantastic team that I've got supporting me. As I've noted here, if you catch me in Mastodon, I'll post a link to the slides if you want to catch those probably within the next day or two. I'll go ahead and get these posted. So let's get into it. So my first thing I want to tell you is my favorite movie is Ratatouille. Now, I can't use copyrighted content in a public presentation, but if you've seen the movie Ratatouille, you know that the main idea here is anyone can cook. So here's the thing. I want all of you to be able to take something out of this presentation and put it in action within your organization. So that means if we're saying everyone can cook, I'm delivering a sandwich. A good news, good news sandwich, right? So your organization you've all enabled MFA, right? Everything's protected by MFA. You're 100% safe, right? Don't raise your hand if the answer is no. But for a lot of organizations, at least for your internet-facing perimeter, you've got multi-factor authentication enabled. So you think to yourself, and you tell your regulators, your auditors, anybody who comes and inspects you, that you're okay. Well, I'm here to deliver the bad news, which is that's not good enough anymore. Well, the good news is here at CypherCon, we're going to learn how to cook up some new defenses. So back to the good news, you did it. You've got multi-factor authentication enabled. Even better, maybe you even moved away from some of the weaker authentication methods like SMS, push to approve, things like that. I don't want to denigrate MFA, because seriously, if you've enabled multi-factor authentication in your organization, you're still countering a significant portion of the attacks. Microsoft places this somewhere in the realm of 99% of all attacks that come up against Microsoft accounts are mitigated through even the most simple multi-factor authentication schemes. That's great. So that's good news. Well, the bad news is our attackers they're adapting. And so there's new phishing kits, there's large-scale campaigns, and the things that I'm going to talk about today, they're happening in ransomware as a service type schemes. So these are happening at scale. And as I go through some of this, I'm probably going to cover stuff where maybe you haven't seen this yet. But this is one of these attacks where you got to kind of go looking for it unless your users have brought it to you. So when we talk about MFA, what I have to do is kind of go through what's good MFA and what's bad MFA. Now, up until this point, most people have thought to themselves, well, SMS is no good. Why? Because we can do SIM swapping attacks, right? Okay, fair enough. Maybe we go push to approve. Well, push to approve is okay, except for the fact that our users get griefed with prompts. So they credential stuff and they request that approval button over and over and over and over, and what do users do? They click, okay? But CISA, they did something kind of cool. So they created a new designation, and this is a term of art. They call it phishing-resistant MFA. Now, what I love about this designation is that it takes your MFA, whatever you're using today, and it puts it into one of two buckets: phishing resistant not phishing resistant. Now, CISA, if you go look and do a Google search for CISA, phishing resistant MFA, they're going to come up with like a 2-page write-up on where they kind of rank MFA methods from weakest to strongest. I summed it up right here. If you're not doing some sort of certificate-based authenticator, so think FIDO key, think TPM module in a laptop, think hardware security module in your iPhone or your Pixel. If you are not using that, CISA is telling you that you do not have phishing-resistant MFA. So I say that not because I'm trying to like make any of you think, oh, I'm not doing a good enough job. No, not at all. This is your ammunition. This is your ammunition with your leadership in your organization to push them ahead by saying, look, the federal government has a designation and we're not there yet. So I think that's a great thing. So why do they call it phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through this attack, and I'm going to kind of demonstrate why phishing-resistant MFA works and why all other forms of MFA simply do not. Okay? So by way of background, the attack that I'm talking about here is not new. It's not novel. EvilnginX, that was released in 2018 as a proof of concept on how you can steal session tokens. So it's been around. I know a lot of red teamers have worked with this and demonstrated that it can be used. But like a lot of attacks, you don't need to do the extra work to implement EvilnginX when good old-fashioned phishing people for username and password just straight up works. Where griefing people with push straight up works. It wasn't until roughly May of last year, based on what we've seen, that attackers finally shifted what they're doing. And they did so primarily because of the EvilProxy software as a service kit. So here's how this works. There's a lot of lines on this graph, so I apologize in advance about that, but I'm going to walk through them one by one. So here's how this attack works. First, your user receives a phishing message. And by the way, the phishing messages they're using are really cool and novel. I've got a whole sidebar about that in just a second. So your victim, they click on a phishing link. They enter their credentials, and they complete multi-factor authentication. Could be a code, could be a push approval, whatever it is, right? Not FIDO2 key, okay? What the attacker has done is they've actually set up a proxy that sits in between your victim and your victim's identity provider. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm primarily going to talk about Azure Active Directory, but these types of attacks can happen in other single sign-on environments. Think Okta, Ping, Auth0, identity providers such as those. Okay. So what happens is when the user clicks on the link, they're brought to a page that's being proxied to them. The page being proxied to them is the page from your identity provider. All they're doing is fetching that page and displaying it to the user. That's why I say the attack's coming from inside the house. The attacker is not doing what they normally do. Normally what an attacker is doing is they're going out and they're setting up a custom phishing page. And those custom phishing pages typically have all the telltale signs because they can't get the HTML right, the image looks wonky, they try to add some text to it, and you get one ad and you can tell immediately that this is a phishing page, right? Well, in this attack, that's not what's happening. They're taking your actual page and proxying it through to you. So then what happens? When the user enters that username and password into that site, that proxy, they're forwarding it right to your identity provider. Now along the way, of course they're going to steal your credentials. Why not? You got an opportunity to steal credentials. Now your identity provider, they have no clue that this is happening. All they see is a valid authentication attempt. So what do? They return your session token. And session token theft is what we're talking about here. The attacker steals your session token. And the attacker, if they feel like it, they'll even forward that valid session token back to you. Because particularly in Microsoft, in Azure Active Directory, they're just starting to bring out some checks for this. But by default, there's no check to see if a token is being reused in different contexts, okay? So they forward the session token back. The attacker, they can do the same thing. So they go ahead and pin that session token in their browser or whatever attack tools they're using, and they are now effectively logged in as the victim with the same amount of rights that the victim has in their O365 Azure tenant. The user, they get logged in. They just end up on a page where, they get to an O365 landing page and they think to themselves, well, that was weird, but I'm back at my main page and, no harm, no foul. And then on top of that, if you don't have MFA on across all of your public-facing properties, or you have other third-party integrations, well, they can go do credential stuffing after that. So I talked a bit about the delivery examples, so let's walk through those. So they still use the dumb old ways, lookalike domains, things like that. And one of the things they do a lot is, we've seen recently, is they like to mimic message encryption tools. So think Microsoft's native message encryption, Proofpoint, Zix, those types of things. But it's just a copycat, right? And with any copycat message, there's going to be some sort of a telltale, right? If you're doing a reasonable job at security awareness training with your users, they're going to see those telltales, okay? But here's what we've seen. And this is an example with Microsoft Purview, which is what they call the Azure Rights Management. And this is a technique that we refer to as encrypted message hollowing. So what happens is, there's a couple of ways to do this. First of all, let's say they already have access to a mailbox. They then can send an encrypted message to their victims from that person's mailbox. Now, the benefit of this is that you, as the organization that's a recipient of this, you don't have the opportunity or the ability to scan the contents of the message. The message is encrypted, okay? So they're doing that through basic mailbox compromise scenarios. But a lot of times, the tenants that they're dealing with are large organizations. Again, organizations that have MFA turned on. It's a little harder to compromise that mailbox of that large organization. But the organizations that are really easy to get into are the smaller companies that you do business with, people in your supply chain. So what's happening is, they're not going after the big companies to use their rights management service, Microsoft Purview. They're compromising small organizations opportunistically and seeing who they deal with. And if they receive an encrypted message, they go into the encrypted message and they open it in their browser, and unless you have it configured otherwise, you can basically change the entire message. You can change who all the recipients are, you can change the subject line, and you can change the message body. Essentially, you have hollowed out an encrypted message that somebody has received. At that point, you put in your phishing lure, and you hit send. The victims get an email that looks like it comes from a normal, reputable, large company, but it contains this phishing payload. And I'm going to take 1 second to rag on Microsoft about this. Because if you have Office 365, you have full control over your key management environment for your users. So when somebody wants to send an encrypted message to you, you should be able to inspect that message, right? There should be a way that you, as the tenant owner, can inspect that message for malicious things. Instead, Microsoft doesn't have some sort of site-wide signing key that can be used for message inspection. All they have are individual user keys. And this makes things really complicated if you want to carry out one of these investigations. Because even your own email administrators, they can't see the contents of these messages. Now, if you're using a third-party client, you're going to get a message that looks kind of like what you see here. It says, click on this to open the encrypted message. If you are in an O365 tenant with all the right management stuff properly in place, you don't see a message that looks like this. You see the actual email itself, but with one key difference. It has a green bar across the top with a green check mark informing your user that the message is encrypted. Now, if a user sees a green checkbox across the top, what do they actually interpret that to mean? It's safe, exactly. So we also have a UX problem on the Microsoft side, because just like the old days when you used to put that padlock in the browser, users are still conditioned that indicators of security are indicators of safety in every context. And so that's what makes this particular form of attack, this message hollowing attack, so effective. It prohibits us from inspecting the content, and it sends an implicit message to the user that what they're about to click on is safe. And what does the victim see? Well, there's one telltale. If you look up in the browser bars, they can't mimic your exact domain. They still have to come up with something. But, and again, I work at Northwestern Mutual. This is just an example I mocked up. What comes across is one of two things. It's either the specific branding that you've put in place for your Azure, your O365 tenant, or it's the generic default Microsoft sign-on. Now, this is where the fatal flaw lies in this attack. So I'm going to come back to this in just a minute. So let's talk about detecting these attacks. There's a couple of things we can do. Now, as we start to talk about detection, not every organization is going to have the ability to do all of these things. So I'm going to run through a whole bunch of them, and my hope is that you'll be able to do some of these. And even if you're able to do just a few of these things, I think you will be better positioned to gain visibility into these attacks and have a sporting chance at stopping them. So one of the first things that we can do is generally available to most people who have an Azure AD tenant. You can turn on impossible travel alerts. These are reasonably accurate. Why are they reasonably accurate? Well, because of your favorite YouTubers. And your favorite YouTubers are constantly pushing those stupid VPN services that your users absolutely don't need. This is message, and by the way, is sponsored by NordVPN. No, sorry. So your users think that they're gaining some sort of security benefit because they've got some VPN client on their phone. Well, great. Well, what that does is that's going to set off your impossible travel alerts all the time. And because the primary and useful purpose of these VPNs is to gain access to content in other countries, they go out of their way to mask where they're coming from. So, you're not going to see one IP block that's called ExpressVPN IP block, right? They've got all kinds of obfuscation on the ownership of all of these net blocks that they use. In addition to that, your attackers are pretty smart. They're going to look up and see where you're headquartered. So if you're headquartered out of the Chicagoland area, or the Milwaukee area, or Minneapolis, that's what they're going to do. They're going to use geolocated proxies through residential infected computers to proxy all their traffic through. So you're not going to trip. So what's going to happen in this case is you're going to have some false negatives because they're using localized proxy services, and you're going to have false positives because they're using consumer VPN services. But this helps. Now in some systems, and in particular I'm highlighting Okta here, I don't believe that there's an analog quite yet in Azure Active Directory. In Okta, you can actually block entire ASNs. So if you have access to a threat intelligence platform, rather than feeding in individual net blocks or incredibly long list of IP addresses, you can basically identify your bad neighborhoods and start to block those with ASN. In addition, if you have some sort of SOAR capacity, I strongly recommend using that to warn people when you see them sign in from places they haven't been before. So we talked a little bit before about these geolocation-based alerts. And I kind of said, well, they're good up until a point, right? We've got some false positive situations, we've got some false negative situations. But if you look at these in addition to other things going on, you're going to get a lot closer to finding this malicious behavior. So one of the things that can happen here is, again, this is an Azure AD specific attack, but if you see a logon from a previously unknown IP address and you see a change in authenticator, you know something's up. Even worse, Azure Active Directory lets you kind of sign up and register your device as an Azure Active Directory joined device. And that is oftentimes the first thing that starts a chain of trust that ends in them being able to access your corporate resources. So, all right, I guess this is time number 2 where I brag on Microsoft. When a person has stolen your session token, they now have the ability to go into the Microsoft Password Self-Service portion of O365. They now have the ability to add and remove authenticators on your account. Microsoft, so now think about this for a second. Let's say that the lure was accessing a SharePoint document and that your authorization should just be scoped to SharePoint. Well, it's not. You're authenticated on that session to the entirety of the Microsoft 365 environment. So that means your attacker with that session token can log in and set up a new phone number. They can set up OTP. Basically, they can give themselves persistence because the session token that they've gotten lasts for about 7 days. Well, they've got 7 days to go in here and do it. Now, what could Microsoft do in this case? They could require step-up authentication for password management events. They're working on it as far as I understand. It is not here. And once they do that, they've got the ability to log on persistently forever. Why? Because again, like I talked about when we did the attack overview, they've got that username and password, and would your user notice if they had a new authenticator registered? Maybe, maybe not, but you can. So keep an eye out for that. So in terms of detection, I talked about the end user experience. I showed what those logon pages look like. And I pointed out the fact that they are not faking logon pages. They are delivering your logon page to the user. And I said before that that has a fatal flaw in its core. This is what it is. Your logon page has things that are unique either to your organization or to the authentication flow of your identity provider. Okay? So for example, if you've used custom branding, you've changed the background color. If you've changed the background color, you've picked whatever your corporate color is. Blue, green, red. And your marketing people, they don't just like the off-the-shelf blue, green, and red. They like a very, very specific blue, green, or red. And they have a style guide, possibly even published on your intranet, that tells you if you're going to do business as us, you need to use this specific hex code for blue. That is the correct corporate color of blue, corporate color of green, corporate color of red. I see a few of you nodding your heads. And I work at a large company, and if I run afoul of custom branding, I will hear about it too, right? Well, that's in the DOM. That's in the HTTP stream that comes back. So if you have the ability to inspect the content of HTTP flows going into your organization, you have the ability to look and see when those unique elements that should only exist in your logon page are being delivered from domains that you do not recognize as valid. Okay? So now you can start detecting that. In addition, Microsoft, for example, they have a specific domain called msauth.net. That domain only exists during the course of a Microsoft authentication transaction. You should never, ever, ever see that domain being called unless authentication is happening. So what you can do is you can start to, again, using your IDS or whatever inspection ability you have, you can look for when those items that you've identified as specific to you or your logon flow occur from unexpected places. Now, you might come up with a couple of false positives, you read those out, and at that point you've got a pretty good idea that this type of attack is happening to you. Again, why? Because the threat actor is not modifying any of the DOM on its way to being delivered to you. In addition to that, you can start looking at the metadata from TLS certificates. Microsoft does not use Let's Encrypt. Okay? Let's Encrypt is great. I love Let's Encrypt. But that is not what is on Microsoft's logon page or Okta's logon page or Ping Identity's logon page. Okay? If you have the ability, again, to inspect traffic and you see some of these telltale indicators that an authentication session is occurring, but the certificate metadata doesn't match up, you've got a good alert on your hands. Okay, third rant against Microsoft, I promise it's my last. Okay? When you're given a session, that session token lives inside your browser, and only that instance of that browser on the machine on which you use it. If you use a different browser on the same machine or the same version of a browser on a different machine, you have to re-authenticate and re-establish another token. So what that means is that your user agent and all of the identifiers around it should always look the same. Does Microsoft check any of this? No. You can just parlay that same token with user agent strings from Chrome and Safari and Edge, and Microsoft's just like, well, yeah, it's a valid session token, I'll let you in. But that should never happen during the normal course of use. Again, I've heard Microsoft is looking at this, but this is still the current state of attack. You can parlay these things. The user agent shouldn't change. Also, look for bad user agents, right? Your users are not using curl to authenticate to O365. If you see authentication events that involve curl, you've got something bad going on, okay? And if nothing else, hopefully you've got a firewall log that you can inspect to identify that some sort of automation's going on. There's some advanced methods. Just for the purpose of time, I won't get into token swaps. The basic idea here is there's some really cool research on this where you can use an existing token to parlay access to things that are even outside the scope of authorization for the token. But I want to get into a bit about purple teaming. So being able to detect this in your environment is an exercise in understanding how your environment operates, what normal is. And the best way to do that is through purple team testing, right? So like I mentioned before, evilnginx has been out since 2018. It runs inside of a Docker container, and it is very simple to use. You do not need to be a red teamer to set this up and try it. It's pretty straightforward. It's a fun weekend project, if that's your definition of fun weekend project. So start to look at what happens when you set up that attack. What looks different in your logs? In addition, you can set up alert thresholds. So if you see a certain amount of MFA failures because they've messed things up, you can look for that too. And then beyond that, again, looking for non-typical authentication endpoints. Another advanced thing that you can do here is Script canaries. I love script canaries. Because if you have the ability to customize your logon page, now you can't do this with Microsoft, but again, this attack theoretically works against any application that has an authentication flow that results in a session token being issued. It can be a big identity provider like I've talked about, but it can also be your organization's front-end portal, your e-commerce portal, whatever web app you have and whatever that authentication flow looks like. If you have the ability to customize your logon pages, check out script canaries. I strongly recommend embedding script canaries into your logon page to get a little more insight into what's going on. Because you know that if this content is loaded, it should only be loaded from a specific domain. If a script canary is in your page and you see it being loaded by somebody who shouldn't, that's going to set something off. So some of that's a little more advanced, but I'm kind of setting the idea of script canaries out there. If you've used them, if you've worked with canary tools, you know, that's one of these things that I think you can look at and decide if you can cook with it. So now that we've talked a lot about, you know, detecting some of these attacks, we're going to look at a little bit at investigation and a few more detection methods. So first of all, if you think you've been affected by this, check and see whether successful MFA has occurred or not. Because you do need to differentiate this attack from a credential stuffing attack, for example. In terms of response, if you know that somebody has stolen a session token, do you know how to actually invalidate session tokens? In typical organizations, when you have a compromised credential, usually what you're going to do is you're not going to want to hurt end user experience too much. So what you're going to do is you're going to issue what we would call a soft password reset. And that's the one that says next time you log in, you get prompted to change your password. And in most circumstances, you know, that works fine. If they just, you know, clicked on some, you know, crummy phishing link and, you know, there's no MFA, you know, bypass method or things like that, yeah, sure, do that. It's not that disruptive to your users. The problem with this is that soft password reset is really designed to be a convenience factor for your users. So it doesn't invalidate their sessions, right? They go back to their browser, they're still logged in like they were, even though their password's reset, maybe they'll have to authenticate again in a couple of days. If you do a hard password reset, which is literally just changing the password on the account, locking them out, and forcing them through a reset procedure with your help desk, that will invalidate most sessions. Despite that, even in Microsoft 365, you have such a proliferation of endpoints that you can parlay that session to, you still have to manually go in and invalidate sessions. And you can do this through PowerShell scripts. Microsoft does provide documentation on doing it, but even doing a hard password reset alone is not enough for this. Now, once you know that somebody successfully did this, the question is, what did they do? Now, hopefully you have access to your Microsoft 365 logs, either within Azure Sentinel itself or forwarded to your SIM. You're going to want to look for access to OneDrive mail forwarding rules, so that's one of their favorites. One of the first things they'll do is set up a mail forwarding rule, so go look for that. Again, look for authenticator changes. And then these last two, user creation and exchange mail transport rules. If you do not have good separation between your administrative accounts and your normal user accounts, well, figure out how to do that. But if they catch the right person with the right level of administrative access, they're going to go start creating new users, or even worse, start compromising your exchange environment, install mail transport rules, things like that. So be on the lookout for those types of things. So from there, we can go do a little bit of offense here. make sure you know all your good authentication endpoints, okay? So, why does NIST start at asset management as the very first thing you should do? Because knowing your stuff is the most important part of your job. Knowing what's normal and what's good and baselining that really is the foundation for being able to understand your environment, understand what's normal and what's abnormal. And once you know what's abnormal, you can decide whether that is malicious or just unexpected. If you're a Shodan user, you can do a lot of hunts for evilnginx and EvilProxy TTPs. A lot of those are public. And then again, search your firewall logs for typo squats. There's a Python script called DNS twist. It's been around forever, and it works amazingly well at generating lookalike domains that correspond to whatever domain you feed it, right? So start looking for those things. And if you look for those lookalike domains, you can also look at it in addition to the common path. So for example, in the Microsoft logon, you have Microsoft.com/authenticate, let's just say, right? What you're going to want to look for is instances where you see your organization's logon in one of these typo squat domains, but also contains logon, authenticate, or those types of keywords. And then beyond that, if you have the ability and the means, keep on the lookout through intelligence sources for threat actors most likely to use that MFA proxy. So I dumped a lot of information on everybody here, and we do have some time left. But really, where I wanted to wrap this up is oh, sorry, wrong slide. Is to kind of encourage everybody here that you may not be able to do all of this, okay? So we covered a whole lot of different ways to detect this, but you can do some of this. So again, be on the lookout for encrypted message traffic. Be on the lookout for those typo squat domains. Be on the lookout for any traffic that looks abnormal around authentication, and you've got a good chance of identifying these types of attacks. So with that being said, I'll take about maybe the next 10 minutes or so and see if anybody has any questions about this attack that I can answer. It is, yeah. So if I go all the way back to the beginning here, if you follow me on Mastodon, I will post a link to this in the next day or two. Sure. So the question was, what the question kind of comes down to is, in a lot of organizations, you're going to have your hands tied a little bit around user privacy, right? There are certain categories that your law, your HR department is going to say, no, you cannot inspect this traffic, right? And have we seen that? Absolutely, yes. But the thing that we've seen more commonly is a domain that's been registered within the last 30 days. So even if a domain manages to get itself into one of those categories, if you simply take the step of implicitly blocking access to all domains that are less than 30 days old, you're actually going to catch a whole bunch of these. But that's a great question.
What about decoupling your MFA provider from your IDP? So using like Azure architecture, source of truth for identity, and then like dual, for example, is MFA?
That's a great question. So the question was, what about decoupling your identity provider or your MFA provider from your primary directory provider? So using Okta for MFA while using Azure AD, for example. Would that work? I don't think so. I haven't tested this, but if you think about the way this attack works, well, yeah, either a YubiKey or using the secure enclave on your phone. Yeah, that's a better answer, right? However, I'll be the first to acknowledge that handing out YubiKeys is a logistical hassle. If you've been doing this long enough, you remember the bad old days of like mailing RSA keys to people, right? And the second you could do this through SMS on your phone, everybody was like, yeah, we're done with this, right? So yeah, managing physical second factors is a hassle. But to your question, I would assume that because they're proxying all of your traffic, that they will have the ability to get whatever session token is specific to your organization. Now, attackers are still lazy and cookie cutter, right? So if they're using an existing attack tool and it's not wired up for your specific scenario, yeah, you might actually get past them because they're looking for this specific value in the return stream and they're not seeing it, and so they just don't catch it, right? That's possible too. They'd have to like custom implement for you and your setup. So there's some possibility of being a little more resilient that way. That's a very insightful question.
What's the easiest way to stay up to date with all these different attacks, just knowing the new ones that are coming out?
Sure. So the question is, how do we keep up to date on attacks? Man, a year ago, I'd say Twitter was a great resource for that. And I mean that in all seriousness. You had a large community of folks on InfoSec. As I've showed in my slide, I've kind of moved to Mastodon. Social media is still a great resource for that. Increasingly, I'm finding YouTube and finding a couple of good security content creators. There's a lot of bad ones. Kind of talking about today's attacks. Podcasts. I still rely heavily on podcasts. Now, podcasts were great when I commuted every single day to and from work. And I would suspect a lot of you, no longer have that commute. So take a walk in the middle of the day, right? Get out your podcast player. Podcasts I like. Risky Business Podcast. Those are those kind of big attacks, big macro trends. The SANS Internet Storm Center, they've got a daily podcast on every current attack technique and things like that. That's what I use to kind of stay up on these things. Yeah, you bet. So the question was, do I know off the top of my head some of those better YouTube creators? No, because I'm old. I just personally can't sit through YouTube videos that have 45 minutes worth of video for something I could have read in a blog for like 5 minutes. But my kids love them. So the question is, what do we do about API keys? I guess for what we're seeing here, this is really around that normal authentication workflow, right? How do you detect if you have a compromised API key? That's a bit challenging, right? My go-tos for that are really go back to baselining your expected traffic flows, right? So if you know that this API key should only come from a specific IP address or IP address range, and should only come from a specific type of user agent, you can at least profile that. And if you see something happening that doesn't match that pattern, that's a good way of detecting API key abuse. All right, any other questions? Well, if not, thank you so much. I'm happy to stick around and answer questions on the side here, and I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.